Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening to everybody who's joining from different parts of the world. We are here today to talk about how do we navigate procurement, creating value in economic uncertainty. This webinar is co-hosted by Ziva and Denali, a WNS company. Before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping items. This is going to be an interactive webinar, so please submit your questions through the Q&A tab. We will be conducting some polls as well. We'd love to hear from you on what you're experiencing and what you're observing. So please participate in the polls. And we will be recording this session as well. For everybody who's registered here, we'll make sure that you get a link of the recording after this webinar. So quick summary on the agenda. So we'll be covering how do we create value. Going to be talking about how should you think about prioritizing during these times. We've got a three key pillar framework that we'll be sharing with you. We want to talk about value beyond savings, and then we've got some very specific takeaways for you, including a Q&A at the end. However, please don't hold back on your questions. If you feel that you want to jump in with a question while the webinar is going through, please submit those questions through the Q&A tab. So with that, I have the outstanding privilege to host three very distinguished speakers, all of whom have been practitioners in their own way in sourcing and procurement for many years. I am Vikas Shah. I'm the SVP of Product and Business Development at Ziva. I'm going to be the moderator for this webinar today. But let me kick it off by making some quick introductions. I'd love to invite Jonathan to start off the introductions.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jonathan Gardner, and for the last 22 years, I've been working in strategic sourcing or adjacent disciplines within supply chain. Most recently, I was Chief Procurement Officer at Albertsons, which is a large grocery chain in the US. Prior to that, I spent about a decade at Starbucks in a variety of executive roles, and also had time at Dell Computers and General Motors. And just like you, I'm accustomed to having deliverables such as cost reductions and continuity of supply to deal with.
Hi, everyone. This is Betsy Pancic. I'm part of the Denali Procurement Services team and work across our North American business unit. I have been a procurement practitioner for 20 plus years. And am now in a role where I work with clients who are looking to optimize and transform their procurement organizations. Very excited to be here with you today and talk with you about some of our ideas for how to navigate procurement during these challenging times.
Amrish.
Hi, my name is Amrish Kapadia. I lead the sales here at Ziva. I have 20 years of industry experience across procurement, strategic sourcing, enterprise technology sales, and have worked with medium to large scale companies, helping them deploy indirect management solutions, realize value out of their indirect spend. Extremely excited to be here today and share some ideas and what we are hearing from our customers in the market today.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, Betsy, and Amrish. I want to set the stage for how Ziva and Denali are working together. As you all may know, and for those who are not familiar with our respective companies, Ziva is a leader in indirect savings and spend management. We're heavily focused on data-driven analytics, combined with Denali WNS companies' expertise around a range of sourcing and procurement services focused on execution. And together, we're driving a lot of joint value for our common customers in the market today. So our first topic today really is about creating value. And it's an interesting time for all of us. The human brain is really programmed to, narrow its focus in the face of threat, in the face of economic uncertainty. And, it's kind of an evolutionary mechanism for self-protection, self-preservation. So the big question for all of us really is, amongst all this chaos and uncertainty and shifting priorities, how do we think about creating value? How do we think about the short term versus the long term? What is the short term for some of you? Some of you are in large organizations, some of you are in smaller organizations. In certain parts of the world, in certain industries, the answer might be very different depending on what you're undergoing. So with that, I would love to take a quick poll and really ask all of you in terms of what are you most concerned about today? Is it an immediate response, or is it building a roadmap for recovery? And I'd love to hear from all of you. And once the polls are in, we will share the results of the poll, and would love for the panelists to chime in. So I believe the polls are on. And Marissa, let us know as soon as the polls end and you're able to see the response of the poll. So here we see about 38% of you have shared that providing an immediate response is top of mind, versus 62% is focused on building a roadmap for recovery. So maybe I can ask Betsy in terms of what are you seeing with your customers? Is this consistent with what you're hearing? And how do you define immediate response versus roadmap to recovery?
Yeah, this is interesting. To be honest, it is a little different than I expected. I thought that there might be more people at this point that were focused on immediate response, but I think this is also a very encouraging sign. And I have a couple of clients that we've been talking to for some time that before COVID-19 hit, we were talking to them about very specific delivery models that were structured in really specific ways to meet their business needs. And then once the work from home happened and all of that, everybody kind of went into panic mode of just trying to figure out how to keep business moving and how to set everybody up to work from home. And so there was about a 2-week period of time where it just everybody went quiet, and then people started reemerging. And I think when people emerged, they realized, oh, okay, we can keep the business moving from this new reality. So now we really have to think about how we're going to set ourselves up to reach our objectives. And objectives could include immediate cost savings, obviously for a good portion of the attendees they do. But I love to see the fact that people are focused on the recovery roadmap, because I think, number one, it's an optimistic view. And number two, I think it shows that people are looking for ways to, move beyond this. And whether it's category strategies or supplier innovation, that they're not giving up on that as a way to continue to drive value in the procurement process.
Jonathan, Amrish?
If I could add something briefly here, as I keep in touch with colleagues at my last 2 stops, I'm seeing and hearing really either one of these answers as showing up. If you are in an essential industry such as the grocery business, you're working faster than ever before, trying to keep toilet paper on the shelves, hand sanitizers, et cetera, et cetera. And frankly, the strategic sourcing team has gotten pulled into really chasing product. Whereas if your business has been idled or largely idled, then you have a completely different concern, and that is mounting piles of inventory, either your finished goods, in your distribution centers waiting for you to pull it, or you could be facing a supply chain that has a variety of nodes or manufacturing points that have been weakened, either from a cash flow perspective or anything else that could happen. So I think depending upon the type of business you're in either in that immediate response category or in that building a roadmap. But irrespective of whatever camp you're sitting in right now, sooner rather than later, and that's the point of today's webinar, you're going to need to get yourself, your teams, and your stakeholders focused on how do you recover and win coming out of this crisis.
And because I would just add one point to our panelists here. I'm hearing a lot from our customers that the roadmap for recovery is critical for them, which kind of lines up with what we see here as a result. And when they are talking in that on that subject, it is the unknown when people come back to work in their factories. How's the new normal going to look like? And making adjustments to incorporate that is what people are really focused on. And that's the roadmap to recovery. What would they need? How would business change than what it was back in February when everybody comes back to work, hopefully mid-May to late May?
So the one question I have on this topic really is, how do you define immediate versus, roadmap when, we have so little information depending on where we live and where we are in the world today. And also depending on how our supply chains have impacted or have been impacted. So how should the audience really think about the timeline for immediate versus recovery roadmap?
Yeah, I think that, what I'm hearing from most clients is, they're thinking of short term as probably the next, 60 to 90 days. And that, long term it goes beyond that, really sort of more to, 3 to 6 months beyond. And I think that there's a big shift happening in terms of, again, how people are thinking about getting work done. I referenced earlier how I had talked to a couple of clients that were working towards very specific delivery models that involved a heavy on-site presence. And, these same clients now are coming to us saying, where do you have people? Who do you have that's available now that can help me? And so they've completely shifted from this idea that the only way to get the work done is to get it done on site. And, they're really looking at the next, like I say, 60 to 90 days to getting, a pretty significant list of activities done. And they're, opening themselves up to a lot of different types of operating models in order to get that work done, as opposed to, how they entered into it, which was, hey, I know exactly what I want and how I want it to happen. And now they're saying, oh, well, that's not an option. What's plan B? And plan B has to include, looking at alternative delivery models.
Yeah, it does sound like a juggling act because depending on which industry and what the immediate response is required, I think it's going to be really hard for a lot of us to kind of think about how do we come up with a framework to figure out prioritization, which really brings me to the next point here in terms of thinking about points of purpose. And Jonathan, you and I have spoken about this framework quite a bit, and you have extensive experience as a practitioner using this framework and thinking about this mental model. So perhaps maybe you can comment on a few of these topics when it comes to point of purpose and give some guidance and tips to our audience in terms of how they can implement this.
Thank you, Vikas. Yes, these are the points of purpose of a strategic sourcing organization as I've become fluent and familiar with working within. And as Vikas indicated, this is a framework for how you can look at your work and how you can characterize your organization within your ecosystem. So that's inside your company, to your senior management, and most importantly, to your supply base. What I'll also tell you as a way of setting this up is that your focus will shift over time, even within a category. As the category and your proficiency in that category becomes increasingly mature and or as business needs change. Final point before we dig in is that if you don't have anything like this in your organization today, just a word to the wise is it takes deliberate change management efforts over an extended period, so like a couple of years, to get your organization accustomed to operating from this framework. And I think you'll see why as I talk about the top three, which tend to be a little bit more strategic than the bottom two, which is where many of us find ourselves living probably more often than not. And so first, create shared value relationships. The so what behind creating shared value relationships with your suppliers, their ownership, and their senior executives is this is really how you can get more out of your supplier partnerships than simply what's in your contract or what's on your purchase orders. And this is where I'd encourage you to look at doing business with companies that have shared perspectives on sustainability, diversity, ethical sourcing, innovation, transparency, and growth. And the bottom line is you've got to drive conversations at a senior enough level within your suppliers so that you can have those. But that's what creating shared value relationships looks like. The next one over is protecting and enhancing the brand. Should be easy to imagine now, given that we're in a crisis. But the fact of the matter is you want to make sure that your supply chain within each one of your categories is a supply chain that you can be proud of when the spotlight is on. And so this really touches on social responsibility, food safety, and a number of other things. And depending upon your organization, this might be the single most critical element of what you do. Finally, before I hand over to my co-panelists, I want to talk about expediting growth and innovation. And in this case, this is where when you're developing your category strategy, you want to work with both your stakeholders, be that marketing or category, engineering, R&D, as well as your supplier leadership, to make sure that you have both the capacity as well as capability to grow revenue through innovation and sometimes capital programs. For a sourcing practitioner, it becomes really important to understand the ins and outs of negotiating intellectual property rights as well as trade secrets internally and externally. And so these three pillars, these 3 points of purpose are incredibly important, particularly over the longer term. So now if I can turn it over to Amarish.
Sure. And in the short term, right, what I'm hearing, Vikas, from my clients and customers is how do they focus on reducing the cost and enhancing the margin in the short term? Back to Betsy's point, what is my plan for the next 60 to 90 days? And the question is, more than ever, data was always important, but it becomes even more relevant and more important in times like these when you have to look at reducing cost. But to do that, you need to have a deep dive understanding on where your spend is, who you're spending it with, and what steps can you take to reduce that cost. So having that information is extremely critical for you to make informed decision. And the most important thing, as back to, I want to reiterate the point, what Betsy mentioned of 60 to 90 days, it is becoming more relevant when customers are asking, can you help us get there in a span of 4 weeks? Can you help us with the data in 4 weeks so I can execute to my plan? Because everybody has pressure right now to adjust or align your top line revenue to your cost, which we all know has shifted dramatically depending on which industry you are in. So that is what is extremely important. That's the point I would like to make, adding to what Jonathan just mentioned.
Yeah, and of course, you know, if we can do all the others, and particularly when we focus on cost reduction, but if we're not getting the supplies and the product where it needs to be when it needs to be there, then the rest of it's kind of useless. So especially in a time like this, I think that it's important for organizations to say, you know, what really is my goal? Am I truly trying to take cost out of my organization, or is it really about assuring supply and ensuring the certainty of the supply? Because otherwise, you know, if I don't have what I need when I need it, then, you know, having saved a bunch of money or having a good bottom line, a good cost from my supplier really doesn't do me any good.
Yeah, this is going to be a challenging situation, any which way you take a look at it. And what I'm wondering is, you know, when you think about balancing short-term versus long-term, and at the same time attempt to create sustainable value for your stakeholders and for your suppliers, you know, the next logical question for me in my mind really is, you know, what are some of the specific areas a procurement professional should look at when trying to maintain and solve for that balance? So maybe I can engage the audience with the second poll here, which is, you know, what are your key focus areas for the next 3 to 6 months? Are you struggling with spend visibility because you don't have enough data or enough visibility into how you're spending, where you're spending, what locations you're spending? Is supply continuity a big issue for you? Because, you know, some suppliers have very strong balance sheets and some don't. So it's going to be really hard for the ones that don't and have razor thin margins, that we do our part to make sure that they stay safe and provide a continuous supply. PPE is a big issue. Right now, when it comes to immediate response, a lot of organizations are thinking about, turning back factories, turning plants back on, right? How do you make sure there's enough PPE equipment for your workforce? For some companies, cash flow is a big issue. I know of companies trying to go and make sure that they've got enough deadlines in place so that if the revenue does fall down and the costs don't change that much, they're able to lean on those deadlines. Amrish talked about immediate savings, and then another topic top of mind is talent, right? The talent pool is shifting, and as some companies consider furloughs or layoffs, or even turning on some of the factories, we would all be dealing with a talent shortage. So here we have the poll results, and it's an interesting mix across pretty much all the focus areas, with immediate cost savings essentially turning out to be the highest one. It's 57%, followed by spend visibility at 52%. Now, certainly there's some overlap here because people are looking at multiple aspects of these areas, but it gives you some idea in terms of what the top 3 priorities are. So if I could just summarize for the audience and the panelists, as I see here, immediate cost savings, followed by spend visibility, followed by supplier continuity. So let me just pause there and maybe get a quick comment from any one of you panelists to see if this is consistent with what you're seeing with your prospects and customers, and what advice are you giving them in terms of helping them get organized for both immediate and long term?
Yeah, I would say definitely this is consistent with what we're hearing from clients. It's interesting around the talent piece because, that was a big issue before this all started. And I do think in some ways, referencing back to the example I gave before of clients that were convinced they needed on-site models until the pandemic, and now all of a sudden they're rethinking those needs. So in some ways, I think that this is opening up opportunities to close the talent gap maybe that didn't exist before. And so I wonder if that's why that's become less of a priority, or if it's just that the priorities that they do have are so intense and so critical that you can't even really think beyond that. But I would say this is definitely consistent. We're hearing from a lot of clients, saying they want rapid savings, they need to accelerate their savings. And so I would say this is definitely consistent with what we're hearing in the market.
Amrish, you're on mute.
From my standpoint, it's also very consistent. As I mentioned before, cost savings, aligning your top line revenue to your cost structure. And for that to happen, you have to have a good visibility. So they go kind of hand in hand. For the first one to be achieved, you got to have good visibility into your spend. And I am hearing quite a lot from our prospects and clients asking for spend visibility through the spend analytics. How can we get there faster? Because back to your point, many companies, depending on the situation, may have furloughed for the time being or have had some reduction in workforce, and more is expected with less. And the way to do that is to get to some basic data so you can get there faster. But this is very much consistent. I would have expected securing PPE supply to be a little bit higher. That's what I'm hearing from my clients, because some of our clients and prospects I've spoken to have managed to get through the short-term hurdle over the next 60 days. But what they are very much concerned about is securing the PPE supply for the rest of the year, starting from about beginning of August till end of the year. They want to secure that product because as workers come back, it is going to be the obligation of the employers to provide them enough PPE throughout the day, throughout the shift. And the consumption is expected to go up 3x, because that's how the new normal is going to be. And so that one I was a little bit surprised about. I thought it would be a little bit more higher, but maybe the poll is saying immediately this has been taken care of. But all I would say is think about a little bit long-term view, which is beyond August, and make sure you have your supplies secured for your companies.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And before I request Jonathan to chime in, just on the PPE supply and making sure that you've got enough planning beyond the immediate term, I think it's really important to know where you stand, as an organization. And those insights are essentially in your data. You know historical spend patterns, the expected spike. You need to overlay that with, the talent that will return to the workforce and match that with the top line and the resiliency of your supply chain to be able to accommodate that top line. So I think that's definitely going to be quite crucial. But quick comment from Jonathan before we move on beyond this, Paul.
Thank you. Yeah, data and having a solid fact base really is a foundation, particularly in these times when so many of you are stressed to take cost out or improve cash flow. If you have that basis of data, then your conversations can be from a perspective of facts are friendly, and you can strengthen and establish the type of relationship that you want going forward.
Yeah. So just on that theme, just piggybacking on, I'd like to share kind of 3 key pillars of a mental model that will perhaps help you consider how to think about the immediate response and, the long-term roadmap to recovery beyond the immediate response, whatever that timeline might be. So perhaps I can engage each one of you on the panel here, starting with Amrish, to talk about how do you think about actionable insights that the audience can actually use immediately and potentially also use beyond the immediate response in terms of how they can get organized within their respective procurement organizations.
Sure. My first comment there would be embrace your data and your analytics. Do not be scared. It is a daunting task, but there are solutions out there that can help you get there quickly and efficiently without having to put in too much complication and involving the rest of the organization. So that's number 1. Number 2, this is the time to look at your spend and your category visibility as much as possible into detail. Back to what Jonathan was saying earlier, right? You want to be able to have a complete view to make the right decisions. Item level analytics and purchase price variance. These are 2 points that they go hand in hand, and I want to talk about that. You may have had a price increase. You may have had certain issues in certain commodities. Let's take, for example, any commodity related to oil, right? What you have in the last 6 months, the scenario is very different. We all know what has happened for the oil in the last 60 days. There may be a chance when you're looking for cost savings, do visit back certain categories where you may have had a price increase. This might be your time to leverage or lock in a better contract because the demand has fallen off the cliff, and you might be able to turn that corner around. So look at it from that standpoint also. Early payment discounts. One thing that I will stress is you have your key suppliers. Some of them are large corporations and can weather the storm, but you do have smaller suppliers that have been a very good partner to you throughout the years and through the cycles ups and downs. This is the time, if your corporation is in a financial situation, a strong financial situation, do consider giving them a better payment terms for the next 60 days so they can weather the storm. But in return, you can also make this a win-win by getting a cash discount or early discount on payments and make this a win for your organization, but also help some of your key and small to medium-sized vendors by offering that key discount or early payment discount. Consolidate suppliers. If this has been one of your agenda items, I would strongly urge you look at this, because if you had certain suppliers in red in the last 2 quarters, I will assure you with this new change in the market and the economy, that list probably has grown. And this might be a time to look hard at your supplier strategy by commodity and see if there is a way to consolidate and protect your supplies going forward. And then finally, convert your spot buy or your maverick buy, as I call it, to contract buy. A lot of buying patterns based on what has happened has changed dramatically to incorporate the changes in the market. And that may continue. The point I'm making is that may continue for the next 6 to 9 months. So the one-time spot buy that you may have had in the last 30 days may be the norm for the immediate term, and you may want to renegotiate those items because you're going to be buying for a longer period and save your company some money there. So those are some of the actions that I would strongly encourage that you look at for your own companies.
Yeah, those are some really good nuggets of insights there, Amrish, and it's really warming to hear that you're engaging and hearing some of these things and giving advice on how to consider some of these priorities. Just shifting gears to combine that with just operational execution, right? So it's not really easy to think about how to get organized, how to figure out priorities, how to go and execute some of these initiatives, and maybe I can engage Betsy here to kind of set the tone and how to set the tone. So Betsy, comments?
Yeah, I think I've had a lot of people say to me in various ways, but the message is basically this is our time as a procurement organization. For those of us who were in procurement during the recession that was very prominent in the U.S., particularly in 2008, 2009, that was a unique time for procurement to really show its value and demonstrate what we could do in terms of establishing both short-term and long-term supplier relationships and supplier strategies that would allow us to see our way through that time. I think this is very similar. And, I do think that our response now will affect the way that our role is perceived in the future. So, our ability to execute now is going to be, critical to our ability to influence as we move our way beyond this crisis. So I'd say, first and foremost, it's amazing to me how many times procurement teams will do things that are completely out of sync with the business objectives. And, we kind of do it to ourselves sometimes when we say, oh, this is the procurement objective, whether it be savings or compliance. If that objective is not aligned with the business objective, then it's almost useless when you think about the way you can demonstrate your value to an organization. So first and foremost, it's really about aligning on the goal. Are we going after immediate savings? Like many folks on the last poll said that they're focused on. Are we going after speed? Is it just all about trying to get orders out the door as quickly as possible and get them filled as quickly as possible? Is it about supply? Is it about continuity? Or is it about obtaining certain types of supplies that are difficult to get right now? So first and foremost, making sure that those procurement objectives and those business objectives are one and the same. There should not be procurement objectives during this time. It should all be about what the business needs, and procurement should align its objectives with that. Next, I really, we talk a lot to clients who they complain about the fact that the procurement team is so bogged down in tactical work that they really can't see their way through it. They just can't get out from under, what we call urgent but not important. And so, the segmentation of tactical from strategic tasks, I think it sometimes feels like a luxury at a time like this. Like, well, I don't even have time to think about how to segment my work. I just need to start to get stuff done. But I would say, we can't fall into the bad habit, or in some cases maintain the bad habit of saying, okay, we're just going to start blocking and tackling and forget about the strategic value of what it is that we're trying to do. I think more now than ever, when we have this interesting opportunity to really demonstrate our value, but obviously a lot of visibility in terms of making sure it happens. We've got to be clear on what people are doing, and we've got to have visibility into the way that work is assigned and ensure that we've got the people that are best suited in the organization for maybe the more strategic conversations with suppliers, the more sensitive stakeholder relationships, that they really have the time in their day to focus on those things. And we can't all do everything. So the segmentation of that type of activity, tactical from strategic, I think is more important than ever, and really shouldn't be treated as a luxury. I think it's critical. And then lastly, we talk a lot in Denali about the procurement ecosystem and this idea that, procurement is, it's a living ecosystem of systems, of processes, of resources, talent, et cetera, and that it's all integrated and everything affects everything else. And so this, again, it may feel like a luxury, but I think that this is an ideal time actually to examine your ecosystem and say, well, what's not working for me? Am I hampered by antiquated systems? Am I hampered by inefficient processes? Do I not have enough talent? Do I not have either enough talent or the right talent? So maybe I have enough capacity, but I don't have the strategic capability within my team. So I think that, maybe this is something that, as we start to move our way out of this, particularly in situations where procurement feels like, hey, I really came through for my organization, for my company, that's an ideal time to look at the operating model, to look at that ecosystem, and start to put some ideas on the table of ways to invest in procurement to ensure that, that long-term strategy can be executed.
And if I may, I'll build on what Amarish and Betsy have just touched on, in that if you've got the technology and the right expertise, in some cases the on-demand expertise, that should provide the procurement leadership team time, which is the most valuable and unique commodity of all, because you can't make more and you can't get it back once it's gone. If you look at the bullets under this relationship management pillar, the first two, if you haven't installed a framework like 5 Points of Purpose or a supplier relationship management process and module, this instant probably isn't the right time to roll it out, but I highly recommend that you become familiar with the tenets and plant the seeds for those vital platforms and guiding lights within your organization. We've talked a lot about transparency, so I'll kind of set that aside for a second and really hone in on points 3 and 4 for something you can do right now. And this gets directly to building, strengthening, and elevating relationships within your organization, as well as within your suppliers. This is the time for strategic suppliers in critical lines of business to kick those discussions up a couple of notches. Go in, of course, with your facts, but go in with a mentality of how can we, supplier, win together? Implicate some of your stakeholders and senior leadership, coach them up on what to say and what to avoid, but pull those folks into those high-level supplier discussions. And I believe what you'll find is you're able to demonstrate the power of yourself, your team, what your suppliers can bring to your organization, and you will have set the stage to do some of the things that Betsy just talked about, which is really to grow out of this from a position of strength. For those trapped in tactical chasing of parts or going through inventory positions, you can adopt that particular tactic, and whether it's a demand supply review or an S&OP process, whatever you happen to call it, implicate some of your key stakeholders in those supplier discussions. I believe that to be important, given that there have been any number of cases in my career where, marketing told you that they were going to sell 10, so you set the stage to provide 10, and either you sold 12 or you sold 8. But the bottom line is that procurement ends up being those dummies that bought too many or didn't buy enough. And you might have you might have both dynamics occurring at the exact same time right now. I don't know. If you do, and chances are you do it someplace in your organization, that's where you want to implicate those stakeholders in the key areas to be on the phone with you're talking about ways to solve the problem with suppliers. It's a tactical kind of hands dirty step that, again, sets a stage for you having a more strategic voice and be perceived differently coming out of the situation.
Yeah, it does sound like a test. It also sounds as if this is a moment for a leadership opportunity for procurement. And the ways we were conducting business and engaging with our stakeholders and suppliers prior to this situation is going to be a lot different than the situation we're embracing right now. So, in a way, this challenge is creating a very, very unique opportunity for procurement leaders across the board to really go back to the drawing board and think about how they want to get organized and implement their priorities. And honestly, really get a elevated role and strengthen their position in the C-suite.
Yeah,
so
I think because if you love procurement like I do, I mean, I am a self-admitted procurement geek. This is what I've done my entire career. I mean, this should be a very energizing moment for people. I know that I don't want to make it sound lighthearted or as though we're being sort of crassly opportunistic. But when you think about what we're being asked to do in terms of establishing, short-term and long-term aid to the business, and in some cases becoming a critical arm for businesses to survive, this is an opportunity for us to shine. And so I think that hopefully people are energized by that concept and not overwhelmed by it. Because I know that the task is daunting, but I also hope that people do see this as a great opportunity to really demonstrate what, not just the value of the procurement organization, but the fact that we have a role to play in the strategic direction of the company.
Yeah, and that gets us to the next topic of conversation, which is it's challenging to talk about best-in-class organizations during these times when a lot of us in procurement are dealing with immediate response or just kind of the day-to-day. But to what Amrish said earlier, it's really important for us to benchmark with best-in-class organizations, especially during these times, and really take on this mission with a sense of purpose where, how do we get there? How do we really figure out the tools and resources to be able to align with the priorities of the organization and elevate procurement and impact the business in a very positive way? So, unlocking data value is one aspect of it. We published a white paper a couple of weeks ago in partnership with Ardent Partners, who's also a source here. But, these are some of the trends when it comes to unlocking data value. Kind of see organizations focused on, total enterprise spend, specific negotiated savings, trying to figure out spend under management, thinking about financial impact, and how are you thinking about those savings? This is going to not only help with the immediate needs of the business, but also think about supply performance and supply risk moving forward.
Yeah, and I think to build on that point, because around the idea of benchmarking procurement organizations, we ran in connection with SIPs, we ran a benchmark study. We had over 300 participants globally, and we really tried to focus on the attributes of high performing procurement organizations. And one of the things that we uncovered is that an overwhelming majority, 78% of companies that are considered visionary procurement organizations segment their tactical from strategic roles. And so this goes back to the point I was making earlier that, when you're looking at the work that needs to be done, there is an overwhelming temptation to just dive in and not really have a plan and not really think about the best way to get that work done. And so, this is to just sort of build on the point that, as we move out of this, which we will, as we move out of this, that, in order to really create that sustainable value, these are the types of things that we need to be thinking about, is around the segmentation of tactical and strategic, around, how do we achieve that total business alignment with our stakeholders and with our organizations. So I would just, use this as a way to sort of reiterate or almost validate the point that I was talking about earlier around the segmentation of these activities.
One of the questions I just received, and maybe I can engage the panelists here, whoever wants to take this on, but the question really is that we've got a small team and limited resources. How do I even segment my work? How do I go about it?
Because I can take that question. It's a very relevant question. And back to the point I was making earlier, right? Time, and I believe Betsy mentioned this, time is extremely important. And this is where the executives in procurement need to make sure they're spending the time wisely. If you can be more strategic and not spend time in being tactical, for example, data is the foundation for everything you do, right? And we spend a lot of time going through Excel spreadsheets to come up with the data that is then used further for the next step within the process. If you can have certain ways in which you can have solutions that can provide you the data, I think it's going to be fantastic. You're going to address that concern immediately and spend 75% of your time, instead of spending 60% of your time trying to mine the data and use 40% on strategic stuff. This is how you make a small, efficient team for the future. Work on stuff that is valuable, that cannot be replaced, and make sure you use the tools that are available to you in the market today to get you there faster and efficiently.
A suggestion that I'll make as you think about segmenting your time beyond your spend data, I encourage leaders and individual contributors to know where your time goes. Frankly, put your activities in an Excel spreadsheet and take a look forward as to where your time is going. And then as a leadership team, a practice that I like to do is to aggregate that so that we know where we're spending our time and we can make decisions that that correlate to what the business needs us to be working on. You also layer that into professional development plans and training and career growth opportunities. Finally, something that we haven't really talked about yet, but it's, how do we get our company to think about investing now in the middle of a crisis in sourcing, whether that's a tool or a relationship with a service provider. If you know where your time goes and you can implicate your senior leadership in trade-off decisions, then the work that you don't have time to do, you can typically associate some value to it, and then you're halfway to a business case. And so it's no more or less complicated than putting your time down in a spreadsheet and rolling it up. But I'll tell you, you'll get more mileage out of that, and you'll be so much farther ahead than stakeholders in other areas that I really recommend that you take the time to manage your time. And to underscore it all, remember, now, soon, later. That's how you should think about sequencing your work over time. Now, soon, later. There you go.
Yep. Speaking about time, we wanted to make sure we reserve enough time for Q&A. So we're actually running on time, and we have another 10 minutes before we wrap up the webinar. Another question that has just come in is, can you talk about how to build a business case for investing during these times when budgets are slashed and budgets essentially don't exist in some cases? So any advice there?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Vikas. It's an interesting question because I think that as, procurement organizations are stretched, back to Jonathan's point, coming back with credible data that shows where time is being spent and how investment can make that more efficient, or how investment can help drive more savings. I would say there's a couple things to think about. So the first answer is maybe now is not the time. Maybe you do need to use this time as a way to gather the data, or as a way to, just get the blocking and tackling done. And then take a backward looking view and say, okay, look at this great job we did. Let's now build a business case. But I would also say, and I'll being transparent here as an external provider, external providers are looking for ways to help their clients. And I think that, whether it's coming up with creative commercial models or, creative pricing models, maybe this is the time to look outside for, being able to provide or obtain some supplier insights, or RFX technology, or some external help in just getting the work done. And that, I think, as a provider that, we pride ourselves on the fact that, we're really here to help procurement organizations. I think our ability to be creative and really, make that help meaningful and kind of put our money where our mouth is. I think we feel that's going to open up opportunities for us. So I would say that, if you are considering looking outside for help, whether it's on technology or process or talent, don't be afraid to approach the external providers that or that you to know because they are genuinely looking for ways to help their clients and to also, you know, use this as a time for them to demonstrate their value.
Yep. Thanks, Betsy. Moving along to address the next question here from our attendees. We have a question which is really trying to understand how do we get stakeholders to a mindset of prioritization when every request seems urgent?
Because I'll take this question. It's a great question, and this is related directly to how do you spend your time being more strategic and not have to spend time being tactical, which is a necessary evil, but you know, somebody's got to do it, but that takes away from the value add that you can bring to the organization as a procurement specialist. And the answer to that really lies within your data, believe it or not. If you have better visibility into your own data and you can identify items that are being purchased by your requesters on a regular basis, try to move up the ladder of getting into a contract for those items. Best in class, some of the charts that you saw before, if you could have 65–70% of your items, which is considered best in class, on a contract, that lowers the tactical work that you as a procurement specialist has to do, because you already have contracts and pricing and supply chain in place, and the orders can go seamlessly without you touching every order. In addition to that, how do you prioritize for your requesters? Understand what their needs are and have a rational decision based on some of the data or the category knowledge that you have that is being given to you from your data. Have a discussion about, look, these items have a typical 15-day lead time. Again, your data can tell you that based on your historic buy. You can inform them so that the issues or the emergencies start going down by adjusting your min-max levels, if you have that model within your company, based on that. The better you plan, the better you're going to be able to have a smooth supply chain and not have those emergencies pop up every now and then.
Jonathan, you have some color to add on that?
I do. I think Amarish's points are excellent. And what I'm going to do is address the question from perhaps a different perspective, in that if you're getting bombarded with a wide variety of requests, of course, the best solution would be an enterprise-wide stage gate where you're evaluating opportunities. If you don't have one, you're probably not implementing it from procurement right now in the middle of this crisis. So what's the next best thing? Back to what I said a minute ago, you need to know where your time and your team's time is going, be able to articulate the types of choices you're being forced to make. As you bring that data, then you take that to the different stakeholders that are asking you to do things, and you ask them to see their data to show you. Chances are they don't have it, but drive that discussion. Put them on the record for indicating why is it valuable to them? What's the value of that which they're asking you to do? At that point, you should hopefully have a variety of stakeholders that are coming together in which you can drive a multi-party negotiation as to what is most important for you to be working on right now, along with the data that goes with that. So it's again, back to leveraging time and looking at the portfolio and where you want to spend this limited commodity.
Yeah, no, that's excellent, Jonathan. And we've got several more questions coming in, so I'll keep this rolling to make sure we get to as many questions as possible. We have another 5 minutes here. Another question we have is, you know, what are things to avoid in this pandemic scenario from a procurement perspective?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the delicate balances in these types of situations, and again, I remember, you know, very clearly the recession 10, 11 years ago, and procurement's role in that. And I think that one of the key things to avoid, and again, it's a delicate balance, is really, you know, burning down the house when it comes to your suppliers. I think that, you know, when we are faced with critical short-term actions, we are going to need to call on our suppliers, especially those that we consider to be strategic. And I think that our ability to balance, and there's a lot of nuanced conversation that happens in terms of, okay, this is what I need from you now, this is what I can help you get later, has to happen. Because I think as much as suppliers want to help, I mean, many of them are in a very similar position, and they're not going to be able to provide, discounts that are, going to far exceed what they've provided before if they can't have some sort of assurance that there's going to be a give and take. So I would definitely, in those discussions, I think avoiding burning those bridges with suppliers, and really being able to structure, here's what I need short term, but here's what I'm willing to do for you long term.
Yep. We have another question coming in which says, should we think about long-term contracts, or should we continue with our maverick spend and spot buys, in this scenario? And long-term is, let's say, 3-year or 5-year type contracts. So should we consider that, or continue with just spot buys?
So, because I can take that question. Times are depending upon the category, as I mentioned before in my discussion. It really depends what category you're tying in. For example, if you are trying to build a contract with a long-term contract for PPE, I would say it's not the appropriate time because prices are through the roof. There is no rationale in the market right now. It's all demand and supply. That would be a bad category as an example. But if there are certain other categories that you're buying where the demand has fallen off, the prices are under a lot of pressure, and if you have a good vendor, make sure, this is important, you have a trusted vendor with whom you're going into a contract. And if that is the case, and if you can get into a long-term contract, this may be a good time for you to do that. But again, it's dependent on your category, your industry, and what are you trying to achieve with a reputable vendor. So don't dive into a contract with somebody that's trying to get into your vendor base for the longest time, and it might be short-lived. So just be mindful of that.
Hey, Vikas, you're muted.
We'll take one last question and then we'll wrap up here. How do we tackle supply chain and logistics uncertainty? Anybody from the panel?
I'm just trying to understand the question a little bit better.
It says, how do you tackle logistics, supply chain uncertainty, which may hamper our strategy in the long run, right? So there are things that you need to do short term versus making sure that you don't impact that, that setup in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what we were talking about before, that, if you have uncertainty right now in your supply chain, it's the challenge of how do I address that immediate uncertainty by perhaps paying more for supply, or perhaps making larger commitments that I normally would make in terms of, the actual buying activity, which could impact your strategy in the long run. And so I think that, this is where, again, I think having some backward looking view on what has actually been purchased, where and from who, and at what price, getting some of that data and some of those insights is going to be critical to structuring that go forward strategy.
And just one more comment to what Betsy mentioned, right? Depending upon the commodity that you're purchasing and from what part of the world are you buying that from, plays also a very important role in this new normal. For example, if you're getting a lot of your raw materials from, as an example, from Southeast Asia, and we all know things are going to be different in the coming months. And if it's one of your key categories or your key commodities, I would look at diversifying and having plan B at least in place, so that if there is a geopolitical event that happens that's beyond your control, you at least have some sort of a backup plan. So if a year ago you were thinking about diversifying your risk, I would consider that point again and actually look at it more minutely and take action if that's possible.
Okay. With that, quick wrap up from all the panelists. I'd love for each one of you guys to chime in. Quick takeaways and advice for the attendees.
Embrace your data. Don't be scared of your data, and you can do wonders by unlocking what it says.
Yeah, and I would just reiterate, this is our time, and this is when we can really set the tone for our role going forward. And this is when we really need to just step up and make it happen.
And I'll close by saying, remember to be a human. So that's empathy, it's transparency, and up-level those relationships internally and externally.
With that, thank you all so much. This has been a very, very engaging conversation. Thank you to Jonathan, Betsy, and Amrish for being there and spending the time to share your nuggets of insights with our attendees. If you have any questions, please reach out to both Amrish and Betsy. You will get a recording of this link in your email. And once again, thank you so much for your time. Stay safe, stay healthy, and all the best. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.